Yep, there we go. Okay, cool. Let me share my slides. Hopefully you can all see that.
Wait. You should probably start with a little who's everyone.
Yeah.
So who's everyone here?
Yeah, I can start. So yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Sam. I'm a PhD student at UCL. And we work, my lab studies motor neuron disease, and we work with a lot of sequencing data. So yeah, the idea is I'd like to learn more about machine learning and hopefully apply it to these sort of big data sets we have to sort of try and understand what's happening in disease. So yeah, I don't know how we want to do this next. Hands up, or should we volunteer something?
I'll go next, and then I'll just volunteer based on the order on my screen. So I'm Annalie. I want to read more Python and practice more Python, so I started a book club on Python practicing. Nicola, you're up.
Yeah, I am Nico. I'm a postdoc at UCL. I am a computational biologist, so I work mostly with proteins. I already use Python, and I'm learning machine learning on the side. So this is interesting. Oh.
Amelie, am I saying that right? Amelie?
Yeah, that's fine. Hi, I'm Amelie. What am I? I'm an experimental psychologist, academic at Kingston, but by night during COVID, I decided to also do a MSc in data science because why not? So here I am trying to practice some Python to complement my degree, basically.
Arturo.
Hey guys, I am a researcher at UCL. Are in computer science doing agent-based modeling on cancer, and I'm trying to see if I can mix the two techniques, machine learning and agent-based modeling, to do something cool with cancer datasets.
Cool.
That's me.
681660.
Sorry, I was joining the meeting in a bit of a rush and accidentally set my name to the password. I've been trying to figure out how to set it back, but there we go. Yeah, so I'm Thordis or Thordis or whatever you want. And I work as a data scientist. I work in a small cybersecurity startup. And my background is mathematics, and I kind of got into data science because, you know, I was interested in the math side and how that played out in computer science. But the longer I've been in the field and the more senior I've gotten, the less actual data science I'm doing. I'm doing way more kind of technical leading at this point. So I really wanted to just get back to machine learning, and just to sort of, because I feel like my knowledge is quite out of date and quite limited at this point.
Amit had to go. He is a clinical fellow in cancer biology in London, keen to learn ML to help with genomic aspects of his project. And then we have Pamela.
Hey, I'm a researcher at UCL in the Energy Institute. I work in the building stock lab, mostly building energy simulation, but also we have some big data sets that might be applied to that. So just generally interested.
Cool. And Sham.
Hello, my name is Shamsuddin Muhammad. I'm from Nigeria. PhD student at University of Porto, Portugal. I'm doing work on natural language processing, particularly I'm interested in sentiment analysis and opinion mining. And I'm here to upgrade my skills in machine learning and Python in general. Thank you.
Cool. So you guys sound like you're going to be in great hands. I will leave you now with the ever competent Sam. Adios.
Cool. Yeah, thanks everyone. Yeah, it might be good for me to get started now. I tried to trim it down a bit from covering everything in the chapter, partly because I tend to be a bit slow when I present, but I thought there might have been a bit too much material to fit in sort of 30, 40 minutes. So I'm going to try and sort of race through and cover sort of the overview of the theory we got in this chapter. And then hopefully we can, you know, maybe have a bit of a discussion at the end, and also sort of plan for the next few weeks how we want to split up the next chapters. I mean, I did see a few people have already volunteered, which is great, but we can sort of discuss that at the end. So yeah, cool. Just to get started. Yeah, I guess the main sort of themes I saw in this chapter was first, obviously, an introduction into sort of what machine learning is and why we'd want to use it to tackle some of the problems that we have. It also covered different types of machine learning algorithms, how the data is input to these models, and how models are built to sort of understand the patterns in these data sets. And then also a general overview of sort of the typical challenges that are associated with machine learning, with some sort of examples of how to try and tackle these problems. But I think we'll be digging into these in more depth later in the chapter, or later in the book. Sorry. So yeah, just to start with, what is machine learning? I think out of the quotes that are in the book, this was the one I sort of connected with a bit more closely. Which is from a while ago, but machine learning is the field of study that gives computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. And I think this is sort of a theme that's sort of explored through the chapter, with some of the examples that we have these complex problems, or we have these really big data sets, and we don't necessarily want to impose our own sort of rules in order to process them. But with machine learning, we're programming computers to sort of learn and find patterns in these data sets, and then use what the computers have learned to carry out complex tasks on new data sets. So the example that was introduced at first that I found quite intuitive, and I think would be good just to go through just as it comes up a bit later with some of the other concepts that are introduced. So the first example that was provided to us was this idea that you could use machine learning to sort of design a filter for your emails that will, look at your incoming emails and decide whether they're spam or not, and send them into your into the sort of spam section of your email inbox. So if obviously now these have been around for a long time, but if you were starting from the very beginning, and you wanted to apply a machine learning algorithm to tackle this task, we'd start with our whole set of training data. That is emails that we want, emails that we know are spam because users have flagged them as spam, and also just regular emails that we don't want to classify as spam. And so the task here is to say, based on what phrases, what words are in these emails, can a model learn what differentiates between these two, and using the labels that have been provided by the users as your sort of way to evaluate how well it's doing, we can then apply this to new data that comes in, to classify new emails where we don't know automatically. And so yeah, I've tried to represent just some of the terms that come up in these books here. Let's say we've got a set of these red letters, red emails. Each one of these emails is a single training instance, or to me, I would have called it a sample, but I'm going to try and be consistent with the book and say it's an instance. And we have the labels for these different different emails in our training set. So the red ones have been labeled as spam, and the black ones have been labeled as non-spam. And so the idea would be that we'd input these emails, our training data into a model on our computer, and we'd ask it, to calculate some features, or sort of some features that are inside these emails. So that might just be, does a certain word appear, and then use, based on these patterns that appear in terms of across all these different spam emails or all these non-spam emails, what are the phrases or words that sort of best differentiate between a non-spam and a spam email. And so out of this training data, our computer sort of learns the patterns to say, to make predictions, and hopefully accurate ones, that is an email spam or not. And so when we get some new data, in this case a new email, we'd input it into our model. It would look at the features that are inside this email and decide whether it's spam or not. So this is sort of, a classification problem that I think is sort of quite common in machine learning, and at least a fairly intuitive one, at least to me. And so, of course, why do we want to do this? In the case of, this spam email problem, if we wanted to do this, maybe the traditional way where we'd come up with our own set of rules and say, if we see this phrase, it's, we're saying we're looking for this word and that word, and if it has these words, then it's a spam email. Then that will work, but we might have lots of different phrases that we're looking for. And the problem here is that we can't, this system we have, if we hard coded it ourselves, is that it can't adapt to new data that comes in. So this, for example, the spammers are sort of learning that, okay, we're detecting these these email programs, and sort of saying that if we use this certain phrase, then it's classifying it as spam, so let's stop using that, and let's stop using that phrase and use a different one. And all of a sudden, this traditional approach doesn't begin to work, and so you're in this constant battle to try and keep updating and getting more and more complex. Whereas if you had a machine learning approach, you could have your input data, and it can learn based on that. But as more data comes in, this can be sort of incorporated into the model, and your spam filter can learn as new data comes up, how this is, how spam emails are changing over time. Another aspect where this is typically useful is it's not just for the performance of finding spam and non-spam, but if we actually inspect what the model is actually doing, that can help us understand what's going on with this problem, or indeed with any other problems we have. So that might be in this case, okay, so that it's quite interesting, the model thinks that these certain phrases are the best predictors that an email is spam. And so, not just in terms of performance and simplifying our programs to sort of tackle these problems, but we can actually use them on these sort of large data sets to try and understand, what patterns are inside the data. So yeah, I guess, what is machine learning? It's just us making computers perform tasks by learning from data. And this helps, simplify our programs. It allows them to adapt to sort of dynamic data sets that, so data continue coming in, and can also sort of help us understand these problems. Yeah, I'm just going to take a little drink. Have a habit of talking without drinking. Okay, cool. Yeah, so what about types of machine learning algorithms? At least it's mentioned in the book, there are some sort of broad ways you can try and classify different machine learning approaches. Although to say, these aren't sort of rigid rules, but I think they sort of help understand, roughly how these approaches differ and how they complement each other. So at least to me, I could sort of see sort of three different ways that was outlined in the book in terms of, what types of machine learning systems there are and sort of how they differ. One is, how is the data we're inputting to our model provided? How is it formatted? Do we have labels with the desired solutions or not? Another one is sort of how our system is actually training. Are we just providing all the data at once? It's learning a model and then we're letting it off into the wild to work on new data, or is it sort of continually learning from the data that's provided to it, and updating as it goes along? And then finally as well, I think something that will hopefully become a bit clearer to me as we work through some examples, but how it's generalizing, how it's performing its inference on new data. Is it just keeping track of all the data it's been provided and saying, do these new data points look like the data we had previously? Or is it trying to build a predicted model from this training data and then applying that to the new data that we see? So yeah, just to tackle this sort of the first aspect, how is the data sort of input into these models? There's, I guess, sort of two different classes here. Supervised learning, that is, does the training data we provide contain the labels or the desired solutions that we want for these tasks? So, in this case of spam, it's, is this single email labeled as a normal email, or is it labeled as spam? And so these sort of problems, this sort of types of data sets are typically used for, problems like classification, like we saw with the spam example, but also for sort of regression problems where we want to sort of predict a certain value, given a set of features we have, and these features have their own values. And so, of course, we can have data that's labeled, and we can also have data that's not labeled. And so we don't want to sort of impose any known sort of solutions on our model, and we want it to sort of find patterns in the data itself. And so, some typical sort of applications of this sort of approach is maybe a clustering, trying to group together data points or samples that, have similar features, to try and find groups within your data set. And also for things like, say, anomaly detection, where you want to find, which, if you have a new data point, does it look like, this set of normal samples that I have, or does it not? So yeah, it's not just one or the other as well. We discussed as well that we can have sort of semi-supervised learning. That is, we have some points like these triangles and squares that are labeled, and then these rest of these data points are not. And so at least these approaches, although I haven't quite got the intuition for it yet, but these approaches will combine some sort of supervised approach where we're trying to group based on the labels, and then some unsupervised ones to try and classify these points without the labels, as whether they're likely triangles or squares. And so when a new data point comes in, we can use that to try and decide whether it belongs to the triangle group or the square group. Yeah, cool. So yeah, I guess, yeah, how the data is provided, does it have labels or not? Again, how is our system actually training? Is it taking all the data in one go, or is it learning as the data becomes available? And so, yeah, just to, I guess, introduce the terminology. When we say data that just learns in one go, you provide it your batch of training data, and once it's learned to model, it's ready to go. And so, it can't learn data point by data point. This is sort of referred to as batch or offline learning. So yeah, with these sort of systems, if you did want to incorporate some new data, you'd have to start again from scratch, and train with your whole new data set. Again, you can have incremental or online learning. I found the incremental to sort of make a bit more sense to me. But essentially, these are sort of systems that can learn, either from a single data point or, a few data points at a time. And so, these approaches are quite useful when you have, really, really large data sets where you're not going to be able to sort of fit them into memory all at once and learn from them. And also, for problems where, the data is constantly evolving and you're going to be constantly receiving new data. And so for these sort of models, they do have one important parameter, this learning rate, which controls when the system receives new information, how quickly does it incorporate that and forget the previous stuff it's learned, and how long does it wait until it starts to sort of incorporate this new information into its model. Cool. Yeah. And then so finally, there's how these models generalize to new data sets. So yeah, again, is it just remembering all of the previous points it had found, and then comparing the new points to that, or is it just building a model and applying that to the new data points? So in the case of remembering by heart, this is referred to as sort of instance-based learning. And so as example here, at the bottom left, the idea is that you'd keep track of the previous data, the training data that you've been provided, And when you receive a new data point, you'll compare it to the known data using some sort of metric to assess how similar they are based on the features you've calculated. And then you can use this to sort of make your decisions in terms of, at least in this case, is it a triangle or is it a square? In the case of sort of model-based learning, it's rather, taking your training data and then trying to build a model that will, best predict your thing of interest from your training data. And then, it won't keep track of the individual points, but it will use this model that's been trained and evaluated on the training data to make predictions when we have new data that comes in. So yeah, hopefully that was all quite clear. I might have raced through that a bit quickly, but yeah, again, I think the key point here is just to say that they, these aren't sort of hard and fast, sort of clear, what's the word? They don't think of them as sort of rigid classes, but it's good to sort of understand when you see a new model described, at each of these stages, what the model is actually doing. Okay. Yeah. Again, I guess just to try and round off, we discussed, obviously we've heard the sunshine and rainbows of machine learning, but obviously with any approach there are a lot of drawbacks and things you need to be wary of, particularly with sort of any modeling approach. And so just towards the end of the chapter, we sort of introduce some sort of fairly general problems that we need to be aware of when we're training machine learning approach. I guess sort of distinguished by, is it problems with the data we've provided, or, is the model not doing something right? And so just to start with the data, I guess this point was quite illustrated quite early on. At the moment, we need, for most machine learning problems, we do need a lot of data. So even to perform well, most algorithms will need thousands and thousands of samples, and for other problems you might need even more. And there was this sort of case study illustrated in the book that although once we get to sort of loads and loads of data, some different models tend to perform fairly similarly. At least you can sort of see at the smaller sample size, it's much more important, the algorithm you're choosing to sort of build your model, in terms of how that performs for your problem. So I think the task here was, I think it was sort of like language disambiguation. I think that is, you've got a sentence, and which words should you be using in that given the context. And so yeah, I guess you can sort of see from the plot, with small data sets, these models sort of perform drastically differently, but this sort of converge on sort of fairly similarly good, well-performing models once we have loads and loads of data. Again, another problem that's sort of illustrated is with machine learning, obviously what we want to do is, provide some data to train a model. And then we want to use that to sort of predict what sort of, when new data comes along, predicts, or generalize to these data points, based on this training data, in the classification point, do these spam emails look like spam or not? And so this was illustrated here with this, I think, example where there were sort of results from a life satisfaction survey from different countries, and we're trying to see how modeling, the wealth of the country sort of predicts life satisfaction. And so the problem here was that, the model had just been trained on these blue data points, but we'd been missing these sort of poorer countries, these squares, and, also some of these wealthier countries. And so if we use this model based on this incomplete data, to try and predict these values, we're starting to see a completely different trend. When we sort of look towards these data points that haven't been seen by the model yet. And so this is, not a problem. This problem that, affects sort of small samples and also large samples. So I guess with small samples, it's more of a noise problem. That is, you might just select by random chance, a sample that doesn't really reflect the general sort of population you're interested in. But at the same time, you can't just collect loads and loads of data and expect it to work. If your sort of sampling methodology is biased in any way, that's going to reflect in the model that you've generated. Sorry, it's going to reflect in the model that you've generated. And when you try and apply it to these new data points that sort of don't fit this training set that you've modeled on, you're going to start to see inaccuracies. So this is one thing to be wary of.
Yeah, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So this slide really send some signals to me that in machine learning, one of the great part is to make sure that our data is correct. The input data, we should make sure that it is representative, there is no bias, there is equal representation. So this is good part that one needs to spend much time to prepare his data so that he will expect a good accuracy.
I completely agree with that. And I think as well, I think it also speaks to sort of being involved at every stage of the process as well, like not just be getting given the data at the end and trying to fit your model. You do need to be aware of sort of how the data is being generated and try and to make sure as best as you can that you don't incorporate biases. So I completely agree with you. That's a really good point. What's up next? Again, this was sort of just touched on as well. I guess just considering the quality of your data, that being that you may have some sort of noise in your measurements. Maybe there's some error in some value that you've tried to measure using some tool or some technique, or you might just have really clear outliers in your data set. And so if you're trying to make a generalizable model, you sort of want to try and avoid these sort of noise as much as you can, just to just try to make sure that you're detecting the sort of general underlying patterns in the data and not just some sort of spurious differences that are appearing in your data set. As well, it's unfortunately, we don't always have the most clean data with everything there as we expect it to be. We can also see missing values for certain instances in your data set, and you have to make a decision on how you want to handle these. If there aren't too many, maybe you could just completely remove the sample. Maybe you could fill in the missing values based off the rest of the instances in your training set where you do have values, or you could see what difference this feature actually makes in terms of its ability to perform the task you want to try and apply, and just see how well does this model do when you train it with the feature with the missing values and when without. I think this does feel like something that comes with experience, I guess. I could definitely see how this causes problems, but I don't know. I think with things like handling missing values, I think it's one of those things you have to be quite transparent about, and it feels like that's definitely one source where you can sort of fiddle with the data a bit to sort of get what you want. But I'm not too sure. Hopefully we'll get some sort of examples throughout the book of having to sort of decide between these approaches, and it'll become a bit clearer. And finally, we're just in terms of the data inputting, I guess it's not just the samples, but also what features of these samples that we're asking our model to detect patterns in throughout our samples. And so really, it's can only perform as well as the features that we ask it to provide, or that we provide to the model and ask to look for differences in. And so we do need to spend some time deciding what features are sort of most suitable for our model, that is, amongst maybe your set that you've calculated, which ones are most useful. Perhaps, trying to combine existing features to, create new ones, or maybe even just to gather more data, and, create some new features. So yeah, I guess, I've sort of covered the data side, the input, what the challenges associated with that and how that can cause problems. I guess it's finally, it's worth just sort of going over what was introduced in terms of, on the algorithm side, we've got our data now. How can we make sure that our algorithm is going to sort of fit our training data pretty well, but also sort of generalize well when we get new data. So I think this is obviously one thing I was sort of aware of even, before sort of reading this book. A big problem, I guess, is, just overfitting the training data. That is, we've got your sample of training data, and, you want to fit your model that, really does well, I guess, at predicting, the values in your data set. But obviously the problem is, your training set is just a sample. It's not the sort of general data that you'd wish to see. And if you're just trying to develop a model that, you want to develop a model that will work generally and not just work really well on your training data. So once it gets out into the real world, it may not perform too well. I quite like the quote that was in the book here. I think that seemed like a good sort of rule of thumb to live by, I guess. That is, overfitting happens when, given the data that we have, we're just trying to fit too complex a model. So, we should really be trying to aim for as simple as possible. So again, there was this example. Oh, sorry, did someone?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what does he mean here by complex? If a model is complex, what is complex model?
I think to me it was, I guess, considering this sort of linear model example, it's like how many parameters you're trying to predict, or how many parameter values you're trying to calculate and use in your model. At least that was to me how I sort of understood it. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add, but okay, cool. Yeah, I'll carry on for now. So yeah, I guess there was this case here on this life satisfaction survey, given the wealth of the countries, and you could fit this sort of polynomial function that really fits the data quite nicely. There's not much difference between the fitted model and the predicted values, but I guess at least here, the training data you have isn't really evenly distributed across sort of the range of wealth that you have. And how confident are you really that if you got like a data point around here, that this model could really predict an accurate value. And so what you'd like to do is try and develop a simpler model that will try and that will approximate the training data fairly well, but won't fit it too well, that when it sees new data points, it's going to be inaccurate in its predictions. And so there's this example here. The term was regularization. That is, you have a parameter value in your model that you're trying to use to help to fit your model, and in order to make sure it doesn't fit really precisely, you can restrict the values that parameter can take. And so I guess the example here with this linear model is that we have these blue data points, which are the training data. I think it's this dotted blue line here is just a standard linear model fitted on these blue points. And I guess you can see when we see these new data points in red, it doesn't predict their values too well. But in the case of this solid blue line, we're fitting sort of a constraint on what range the sort of gradient parameter of our sort of linear model can take. And so when we do that, we sort of avoid fitting really precisely to the training data. And, when we see our new instances, we're seeing sort of a better prediction, or, yeah, I guess less difference to the actual value in the prediction. And so, this constraint that we set is sort of decided before we input the before we, input all the data. And, as part of, any sort of model design and evaluation stage, we should, be trying out different values of these hyperparameters, training different models and seeing, which one generalizes best. Okay, yeah, and I guess it talks about overfitting, but yeah, and you can also have the opposite problem, where you're underfitting, and you might not be predicting your values in your training data set well, and you're also not going to be fitting when you see new data points. You're not going to be you're not going to be performing very well at predicting their values. So I think if this is your problem, I guess there were a few sort of solutions that you could try. See, one is to sort of change your model and go for a more complex one that sort of has more parameters that you can fiddle with. Another is to go back to your input to the model and trying to say, okay, maybe I need to calculate some better features for my model to find patterns in my data. And again, just touching on this previous example, we can sort of be less stringent, be more relaxed on this regularization hyperparameter. So the parameter that we're trying to predict, we're having a bit more flexibility in terms of the range of values it can take, and hoping that that allows us to fit a better model. Yeah, I guess there's one thing, I think I switched the order around a little bit from how it's presented in the book, but I think there's this problem that I think hopefully we'll, during chapter 2, during the whole sort of run through, we'll get hands-on experience of this. But essentially, I've sort of discussed, maybe there's different parameters, different models you should try, and what's the sort of best or least biased way of evaluating performance of the model, just to make sure that it's not overfitting or underfitting the training data, and it's going to perform well when it sees new data points. I think, yeah, the sort of key here was that you have your training data, and you don't need to sort of train it on all the data and then just send it off to work on your new data points. You can use your training set you have and split it up into different sets. That is, you have a training set which your model trains on, and then once the model's been trained on this training data, you can evaluate it by seeing in your input, seeing in your test data how well it performs. This is based off the data that you provided, and so this sort of allows you to, I guess, sort of balance between these two things of underfitting and overfitting. That is, you get an idea of how well the model performs on the training data, but also by looking at how it performs in this test set, how well it's performing when it sees new cases, and that can tell you how robust it's going to be when it sees data in the wild. Again, that's just evaluating a single model, but when we have lots of different models, we might not be sure which one's the best. Obviously the case here is just to test all these different models, and these different settings we can provide for the models, and then evaluate how well these perform. And so one way you can do this, one way you can do this is taking this splitting approach, and just set aside a section of your training data, and don't use it for training the model, but use it to evaluate how well this model is performing based on your input data. So I guess two terms that were used to sort of describe this set were validation set and the dev set. And so you train all your potential models on this reduced data. So that is the training data minus this validation set, and then you deploy the trained models to your validation set, and then select the model that performs best. I think sort of one thing that's not been discussed yet, which I think is also I'm just about to get to, but that is, we're splitting our data. What's sort of the best approach to do that? If we only do it once, then maybe just on some random subset of the data, this model performs best, and actually in reality, it's that's just by the chance of how we've split the data. It may not actually be sort of generally the best approach. So I think the message I got at least is when you're doing this evaluation, particularly on your training data, is that repetition is key. So if you just performed one split of your training data and separating it into the training data and the test data, if you just selected a model based off the one that performs best on this single split, what you're really doing is actually just picking the model that's sort of adapted best to this particular set. And obviously, because we're just arbitrarily splitting out the data, that may not be a general solution. So it seems best practice is to perform cross-validation. That is, we'll make multiple of these sort of validation sets, these training and test bits, and every time we'll do the training and then evaluate on these validation sets. And then we'll ultimately pick the model that performs best on average across these different splits that we generated. And so that's a bit more robust to sort of, random differences, I guess. But obviously that comes with a caveat that, you're training many, many more times. So there is a bit of, a time penalty associated with that. But yeah, so I guess, just to go back, back to the key themes of this chapter. I guess we obviously started with what is machine learning. That is, we're programming computers to learn from data and then ultimately, perform tasks we want to. The data that we provide, can have the solutions we want, the labels, let's say if we were performing a classification approach or something like that. But they don't have to be. And again, these algorithms can, either learn from a big batch of data that we give it, or can learn as it goes along. And as we do this, we need to just be a bit careful of the data we're providing to the model, and also that our model is not, just overfitting too well to the training data we provided, and won't generalize when we see new data. I think that's it. I might have one more slide. Yeah, I think this was sort of touched on it. It felt a bit sort of out of place to me in the chapter, but at least with chapter 2 we're going to go end to end through this whole sort of through these different stages that I've outlined previously. But essentially, I guess we talked a lot about the theory and then the theory behind each sort of different step, but not trying to connect it together yet. So essentially, I guess with the next chapter we're going to be or we'll be provided the data, but typically you'd gather your data, training data for your task of choice. You'd pick an algorithm or a set of algorithms, and you'd also decide on some features to sort of calculate from these training data, and then you'd apply your algorithms of choice and evaluate them to decide which one performs best on the training data and approximates well to sort of new data we'll get. And then, that's where happy days for us, where it's doing what we want with our new data. So yeah, I appreciate I talked quite a lot. I guess, I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts on the chapter they'd like to share, maybe some things I didn't cover so clearly. And I think as well, once we've done that, it'd be good just to decide how, as a group, how we want to sort of split how we're going through the chapters for the next few sessions, just so we can map it out a bit. But yeah, thanks everyone. And yeah, it's good to see so many people joining. Cool.
Thank you. I was going to say, thank you for the coverage. I think that was really well done, and I appreciate it. Takes a lot of energy to talk for that long. So thank you for giving this rundown. I was just going to say one thing, and I think it was 2 slides before this one when you were talking about the cross-validation and the test dev set. Because the way that I understood it was that those two were actually 2 distinct things. Because I think usually the way that, was it this one? Oh no, okay, sorry. Okay. In that case, okay, yeah. So you've got the validation set there, but then I think at the very end they also talked about something called like test dev set.
Yeah, I've got to admit, I didn't quite fully understand the distinction. I think, yeah, because the example they gave, yeah, maybe someone else has made more sense to someone else, but yeah, the example they gave, it was, you know, maybe you've got some images from like the internet, but your actual data is going to be from your phone. At least they suggested, well, okay, if it's not performing well, then, you know, you can try and pre-process your data to, you know, fit better. But I didn't quite get how that was distinct to, I guess, doing this and saying, okay, my model's not performing very well, let's go back to the input and you know, and then pre-process it. Yeah, I don't know.
The way that I understood it, so I'm familiar with like validation sets, but this test dev set was a completely new concept to me.
Yeah.
But the way that I've used validation sets before is because typically you'll have a range of machine learning algorithms that you have trained, but you're not sure which one is going to be the best one.
Yeah.
And for each one, the temptation is to just go and look at testing data and say, okay, it is performing this well. But if you do that repeatedly, you're actually biasing your model selection towards the test data, and the test data again isn't like it's just a sample of all the observations. So what you do instead is you have a range of models. Like, let's say I've got like, I don't know, okay, can't think of any good examples. I've got 3 different models, which could be of completely different types, like one neural network, one linear model, one something else. Then once I've kind of fine-tuned the parameters for each one of those and got the version that I'm happy with based on the training data, then I test those 3 on the validation set to choose which one of the 3 to carry on to test on the final test set. So I think that's quite standard. But I think the test dev one, that seemed to be, like you were saying, approaching trying to tackle quite a specific problem where we suspected this bias, or sorry, not bias, but we suspected the training data doesn't represent real data, I think it was.
Yeah.
So if things perform very well, both in the training set and on the test dev set, but then don't perform well on real data, then we know that we've got an issue in the training data that is not representative. But it did seem very specific. Like, I've never come across that or heard about that before.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that helps. Yeah, because I wasn't too sure about it either. But yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you.
Well, if I may, great explanation, by the way, Sam.
Thank you.
Very good. I only had a couple of doubts regarding, there was a section on batch and incremental learning, because while I was looking at some books before, kind of batch and the incremental learning, those are used in different contexts. So usually the batch learning is when you have some constraints on the amount of memory that you have. Imagine you have just a regular desktop and you have to try to fit your model in a low memory machine. Basically, doing batch training is you just split your initial data set into something that your GPU can manage. And then at the end, after you learn all the features, you do batch normalization and you kind of normalize all these batches together.
Okay.
Yeah. While the incremental learning, apparently, well, I'm still a noob on this, but technically what you're trying to do, you're trying to optimize these weights and these functions that you use to minimize these weights inside each neuron. So the incremental learning is telling you how quick you're going while minimizing these functions. Because there are sometimes certain occasions where you can probably skip the minimum just by literally going too fast. So you have to tell the network to proceed slowly by finely tuning these weights. And that's what probably they meant with that. But I don't know, maybe they use it twice and use the same term twice. But I don't know. Yeah, those are the only 2 things I.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you.
The thing that I found interesting, but also they kind of glossed over it, was the reduction of data dimensionality, how to clean up your data.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to do PCA, principal component analysis, on all of these big data sets to try to find some correlations between the data, especially with data that's very, very noisy. And I think in the context of biological data, that's pretty much of all of the data. Everything is very, very noisy.
Yeah.
And specifically, principal component analysis helped with missing values of the data. There were some techniques that were interesting. So hopefully they'll talk a little bit about them. They do mention the principal component analysis as a machine learning algorithm, which I wasn't really aware of. I thought it was more like a statistical method. So I'm looking forward to seeing a little bit more about that kind of thing.
Yeah. No, I could agree with that. I mean, yeah, but I think PCA is probably the main sort of dimensionality reduction sort of method I'm familiar with. And yeah, you're right. They didn't really seem to touch on it too much at the moment, apart from sort of, I guess, mentioning it as an approach. So yeah, like you say, I hope they do go into it in a bit more detail.
But all in all, I thought it was a good introduction chapter. Sorry to.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I generally agree, because I think for me, I've not really done much at all. I've just been sort of exposed to it a bit through different people in our team sort of presenting. So it was nice to sort of get an overview of all the terminology, I guess, which is the most important thing, so you don't get lost. But yeah,
I found that really useful as well. Like there were a whole load of, like, most of the terms were things that I've come across before.
Yeah.
But what it gave me was kind of a framework of how they fit together that I've been lacking, which I found really useful.
So my question is just regarding the format, because I don't know how the format will be. Is it like the format someone would just give the lecture and at the end of we ask question, or we can interrupt? It's kind of discussion. You interrupt along the way, answer question. I don't know.
We can yeah. I think the way I did it, I think definitely, at least with the introduction, I feel like it was, as an overview, there wasn't too much we were doing, I guess, apart from just sort of trying to process it. I think absolutely when we get further in, especially when it comes to examples and stuff, it may be worth just sort of, giving a few, just going through the broad strokes and, maybe showing some, actually working through the examples, I guess. And that might be, more fruitful. I think at least here, I didn't really want to present the sort of the exercises today, just because it was more sort of, textbooky, can you remember what's in the chapter? But I think, in the future, it would definitely be good to, I guess, try and show more practical examples, and then we can sort of see how people found them and stuff. So yeah, I think in the future, definitely just interrupt and stuff if you're not clear.
Right.
But we can definitely, can do with it what you like, I guess. It's sort
right.
Of,
right.
That's my view anyway. But yeah.
Yeah. So in the future, maybe the present sessions will be doing live coding, like trying to do the exercise, not just the slide. I don't know.
We can definitely do that. I mean, I don't know with the examples, some of them might take a little while to run, but we can definitely, I think I know with the other book, the other textbook, they've started a GitHub thing. I think it would be good to just sort of, at least in our examples, just go through it chunk by chunk. We might not be able to sort of run it. We might not be able to run it as we're doing it, but absolutely, I think to show the examples would be good.
Right. What about the exercises?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I think definitely in future we can go through we can focus on the exercises too. Yeah. I'd definitely be in favor of doing that. Yeah. I think the balance, I don't know, it's tricky. I think it would depend on the chapter, but I think especially now that we're going to get into the practical stuff, it would be good to maybe emphasize more on the examples than than what's presented in in the chapter, but I think it'd still be good to give an overview of what's in the chapter too. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, this definitely could be, you know, sort of democratic thing. We can work it out as we go along. But yeah.
I would like to add answer one question that was being asked at some point in the chapter. It was regarding the overfitting and the complex model and how it makes the data overfit. So if you can go back to that slide.
Oh yeah, sure. Oh, I might have gone over
Yeah.
this one.
Right. So one of the YouTube lectures that I saw, how the complex model overfits the data is something like, say, if like simplifying the example a lot actually. So suppose there is a XY plane and there's Y is something that you're going to predict and X is the independent variable. So suppose a linear line fits the data. Say that is the correct fit to the data, but but our model is complex enough. Say that it's a fourth order or fifth order polynomial that fits the data. So that is an example of a complex model that fits every part of the training data, but will perform really poorly when we go into the real test data, because the best we should do in that scenario is probably fit a straight line or probably fit a second order polynomial, rather than going really high and trying to fit all the training data and have an accuracy of say 99% in the training data, but not so good in the generalization phase in the test data. So that's one example of complex model that's trying to that is applied on a given set of data.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thank you. That was really helpful. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I guess I just realized I think we should try and probably keep these to an hour as best we can. I don't know if does anyone else have any more anything they want to raise, or should we just try and I guess just go through